Okay, I think we'll get going. So I'm going to hand over to Jo, who will take over from here.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining this part 2 of our annual review for brands event. I'm Jo Fenn, the Global Director for AdGreen. It's great to see so many people have joined this call. If you weren't able to join us for part 1, we'd really recommend going back and watching it after this event, as there's some really great data in there which is relevant for those working for brands, in a brand, such as the sort of average footprint of a project during 2022 that we found from our data, and also the split by activity area. So how much of the overall footprint you might expect to be attributed to travel and transport, or how studios and locations are powered, for example. So lots of great insights on our data during that session. So please do go back and watch that. In this session, we're going to hear from some brilliant panelists who are introducing sustainable practices and measurement to their companies and those who are supporting them. We might not get to live questions for our panel, but if you do have questions, as Lauren said, you can pop them in the Q&A box in the sidebar, and the team will try and respond as we go through, and I'll pick up any at the end that we've got time for. To get started, I think Lauren has a poll question that's going into the Q&A at the moment, or into the poll section, sorry, that we'd love you to answer, which should show on your screen, I think, in a moment. It's really helpful for us to know from event to event how responses change, so please do answer that if you can. And before we get started, I just want to take a moment to thank our industry partner, Get Set Higher, for their support, which enables us to run these events for the industry. And this is kind of the 4th of 4 events centered around our annual review, which came out in March. So if I can ask my lovely panelists to pop their videos on, please, that would be great. And I will go ahead and introduce you. So today we've brought together those who are helping to push sustainability in production from a brand point of view. So firstly, I'd like to welcome Stuart McNaughton, Head of Public Affairs and Sustainability at ISBA. And we're also joined by David Akeredolu, Global Lead for Creative Production at Diageo, and we have Tracy Dunn, Global Director of Industry Relations at APR. Hello, everybody.
Hey. Hi, everyone.
Hello. Hi.
Hey.
Okay, so we were meant to have a 4th panelist, but unfortunately Matthew Aubrey, who's founder of Home Things, isn't able to join today due to a family situation. But we're planning to add a case study about their recent campaign, Just Add Tap, to our website soon. So you can find out more about how they are taking sustainable business approach into their production when we publish that in a few weeks' time. So let's get started with the questions. This is a full sort of chat session today. So I'm going to kick off with a question for Stuart. So first of all, I'd like to ask you, Stuart, why you think it's important for ISBA as a trade body to support the sustainability efforts of the brands that are your membership and also the sort of wider industry.
Thanks. I'll just take a moment just to thank the AdGreen team for putting this event on and inviting ISBA to be part of the conversation. Thanks to you guys. I guess with this as a trade body, we are kind of taking more action or seeking to take more action in this space purely as a reflection of the growing importance and priority that this has for our members. We're a member-led organisation like most trade bodies, so we are kind of seeking to understand and hopefully answer and address the questions and issues, barriers that our members are facing in this space. So whether it's from the production side of things, which obviously AdGreen is a really valuable carbon calculator tool for, but also broader measurements such as the measurement of emissions associated with the different media choices is another issue that's coming up. And we're starting some areas of work on Scope 3 emissions for particularly, which is slightly different for brands as advertisers as opposed to other parts of the ad industry, such as media owners or creative agencies, for example. Brands have a slightly different what kind of Scope 3 relationship with that. And also the changing regulatory environment. So I mean, yes, I'm now leading and just recently taking on a bigger role as of sustainability within ISBA, but also I do public affairs. So with my public affairs hat on, the ASA is increasingly active within this space and only just recently brought out some refreshed green claims guidance. Politically, there's increasing scrutiny on this. There's a new net zero and energy security department within Whitehall, but also then has the broad issue has more time within Parliament and parliamentary debate, as well as a select committee that will now be looking at net zero issues. So yes, you can expect greater political scrutiny around this, I think is fair to say.
Mm.
But also
Mhm.
then kind of consumer, this is a big issue for consumers, so consumer pressure, and also kind of pressure and questions and discussions within the supply chain. So as a result of all that, we've launched a new member-led working group, our sustainability forum, that is seeking to look and understand these issues, first understanding the barriers and questions and problems that brands are facing, and then seeking to kind of bring in people with the skills, or for us to seek to understand how to address them. And for that first one that I mentioned, obviously production, AdGreen is the AdGreen carbon calculator is a really valuable tool, and is a really important part of that mix.
That's great. I think it's really interesting because, obviously we've been working with ISBA for a while now. It's great to now have you in the role that you are in the sustainability, sort of, leading on that within ISBA as well. And it's been really interesting for us over the past the past year to see the sort of interest from brands really ramp up, and also the sort of focus of that change a little bit from kind of, oh, what's this, we're interested, to right, we really need to kind of get on board and understand how this aligns with this part of our reporting, how we can sort of engage our production suppliers. So from our point of view, we can really see what you've talked about kind of filter through into their consciousness and sort of come back to us. So it's great that it's all kind of all sort of linked together with the support that's available from you guys as well as us. So David, talking about one of those amazing brands that are doing great things. So Diageo Society 2030 Spirit of Progress. So it's looking to pioneer kind of grain to glass, I love that, sustainability. As a company, you're aiming to decarbonize sort of across operations by 2030, and are working with suppliers, which would include production suppliers, to halve theirs. How does this sort of bigger picture company-wide approach feed into sort of how you're approaching the production side of things?
Sure. So Diageo's 2030 Spirit of Progress plan is our ESG plan, which is around driving positive and long-term impacts to society around us. And that global ambition very much is at the heart of the strategy that we have across creative production to drive more sustainable productions. And there are some core KPIs that run throughout all we do from a production standpoint, and those would be around by 2030 achieving a 50% reduction to our scope 3, achieving zero waste to landfill, and being net zero within our own supply chain. And then by 2050 it's about being net zero across our scope 3. And sort of the reason why I'm speaking about those two KPIs, to sort of bring that to life, within creative production, we have a sustainability charter that helps to drive and support more positive discussions, planning and delivery across all of our creative productions, and ultimately drive those two KPIs. And of course, AdGreen's carbon calculator has a critical role for us to play, and we implement that into all of our productions, specifically around the scope 3 tracking for us. But also importantly, what I wanted to call out was not only within creative production, there is a big focus cross marketing as well. So we have a brand activism program that is a training program for our agency partners and brand teams to really drive and support more sustainable thinking and planning cross category. So for instance, there is a focus around POS and experiential, and obviously the beauty of that is, from a creative production standpoint, it just means there's an ongoing supply of cross-category insights and opportunities that we can continue to integrate to evolve, this ambition to be more sustainable in how we create.
That's great. And I think, sort of obviously where we can support you guys in that is helping you understand what your kind of benchmark is, or what your sort of baseline is for, looking at how, whether you've halved or whether you've started on that journey, or how far on that journey you are. I think that's something we can really sort of, for the brands that are on this call, that's something where we can really help the brands understand the data they've got, understand how to kind of engage more of their production suppliers to get more information, more insights, so that you can kind of work on that basis of what you're trying, what you're sort of working towards achieving. And it's been really interesting to see sort of your journey sort of with us through that as well. And that kind of leads me neatly on to Tracy. So as production consultancy, you said you're from APR, and you're really supporting marketers to transform and optimize their sort of whole content production ecosystems. As you said in our annual review, you've seen a sort of increased interest in environmental sustainability reporting from your clients. How do you kind of see APR's role, and that of other consultancies as well, in supporting that shift to low carbon production?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, the thing to start with is that brand teams, agencies, production companies across the board have already got a lot on their plate, okay? We've got, you know, an ever increasing, evolving landscape to navigate. We've got, you know, economic problems that we're trying to contend with at the moment. And suddenly, on top of all of this, we're expecting our agency partners and brand teams to become sustainability and ESG experts overnight. And I think that's probably one of the key places where we can help plug that gap, both from a resource perspective and a knowledge perspective. You know, we're just expecting people to be able to find the time to activate this stuff themselves internally, and it's just not possible across the board. And also, many people are even now still at the very beginning of their journey. And so what they need is somebody that's able to come in and help them start to think about what a carbon reduction strategy could look like for them, for marketing and production. A key component of that is really trying to join the dots between those corporate organizational commitments that are being made and trying to understand how marketing and production can contribute to those commitments and support them in a really, you know, in a actionable way. You know, because there was a lot of theory spoken about in this area, and it's about how, in practice, what can we actively do on a day-to-day basis to support and contribute to those commitments. And of course, thirdly, we've just been talking about the importance of data. It's a key component to any sustainability program that we put together for our clients. And really, I guess, I think our role as data-driven organizations by default in consultancy, we are really, you know, there to be able to help our clients use that data in an insightful way and turn it into action. As you say, looking at where we are now and then starting to use that information to set achievable targets to support those corporate commitments, and also ensure that there is a measurement system in place to really track that improvement. For us, and you've heard me say this 1,000 times, I do fear for those organisations that are not early adopters of any kind of a data tracking strategy or use of the calculator, because, as we were just saying, mandatory reporting is coming, and it will be across scope 1, 2 and 3. And so there will be a mad dash for some organisations that, as they start to approach their target completion dates, don't have the data they need within scope 3 to be able to report on the journey that they've had or the improvements that they've made. And so it's really key to start now, to start having a look at how you can to gather that data and report against it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're sort of anticipating we're seeing as well a kind of growing set of questions around, you know, how do we get started, what, you know, and we've sort of been talking about helping people define the scope of what they want to start with. So, you know, is it productions over this value or productions from this territory? It's like, how can people sort of get into it without sort of feeling completely overwhelmed? And I think you guys are doing great on the segues, by the way, because that really leads neatly into the question for Stuart, which is sort of, what do you anticipate being the biggest hurdle for brands, knowing that that's sort of coming up and people maybe aren't sort of on the case yet? What do you think is going to sort of potentially be a problem for them, or something they need to kind of think about now rather than sort of, you know, the night before the deadline, like you're back at school or something?
Yeah, no, I think as you say, Joe, I think that follows on from what Tracy was talking about, really. And I think that sometimes there's a couple of different ones I think that I would just highlight quickly. But I think the first one is sometimes people not knowing, as a hurdle, not knowing where to start. And the first one I'd say is what Tracy was talking about in terms of start collecting the data, you know, start building that picture, start monitoring, because without understanding where you are, you can't work out where you need to get to, where there's some low hanging fruit for you to cut some of the emissions within your production, whether it be travel, whether it be kind of accommodation, whether it be kind of other elements of that, even sometimes catering choices, or kind of doing less on set and using virtual production options. There's lots of things that people can do and be really creative with, but without, as Tracy said, collecting that data and building that picture on something where you are, it's difficult to work out where you want to get to. So I'd say that's sometimes the first hurdle. Second, I would also say, I think, again, as Tracy touched on quite rightly, there's cost concerns, with the cost of living pressures that there are at the moment. I think people worry that there will be a big outlay and have to make lots of changes, but actually I think there's an opportunity there. Yes, there could be some short-term investment needs, or just kind of working practice changes that people need to adapt to, but actually there's a real opportunity there. Again, if part of the monitoring that people do and data collection shows that you could really drastically cut your carbon emissions for a production by sending less people far overseas, cutting your flight, or even just cutting your overall travel, there's some actual then savings to the business to be made there. There's other elements that can actually be a cost benefit if that is a concern. So I'd encourage people to look at it as an opportunity rather than a reason not to start engaging with it. And lastly, I'd also say that I think time or kind of skills is, again, I think some things Tracy slightly touched on, and then it's really hard for people all of a sudden to become ESG or sustainability experts, but there's a need for people who want to engage in this. And I think what I try and say is, again, that there's an opportunity, and I just encourage people that if you are the person in your organization, the person within your brand, your marketing team, where this is an issue that you really care about, then I think get involved and kind of kind of speak up in terms of why you think it matters. And I think then it can, starting those conversations is a great place to start. And again, it's an opportunity for building new partnerships, being quite innovative, opportunities for the brand or the business to be seen as becoming a market leader, and not just talking the talk but walking the walk. So I'd encourage people that there's opportunities there as well to get involved.
Yeah, and I think to kind of build on that as well, the sort of pressure to be perfect is real, and I think for a lot of people that can hold them back from sort of doing anything. And we found a lot of people who are sort of like, oh, we don't know where to start, oh, this feels a bit kind of complex. And as you sort of rightly said as well, a lot of the sort of investment is actually sort of tweaking processes to allow for things to happen at the right point in your production process, and the time to be available. And we all know time is a massive pressure already, and it's another thing to add to the list. But I think using the tool, once you get into it, you're like, okay, I get it now, it's become part of my process. But there is that sort of initial sort of outlay. But yeah, the sort of pressure to be perfect, get started, have a go, we can help you. There's lots of resources that we've got as well. And I would also sort of add that the only sort of role in terms of the tool for the brand is one of a reviewer. So you aren't the ones putting in all the information about your footprints. It's a collaborative process with your production suppliers. So the role of a brand or a consultancy is really to kind of check over the projects, make sure they're sort of showing you what you'd expect to be seeing for that, that size of project, that scale, whatever it might be. And it's down to the production suppliers to sort of do that actual sort of data gathering piece, which we're sort of also trying to support on as well, in terms of educating people to how to do that as quickly as possible, how to use their budget as a guide. We've got a new training module coming out next week to sort of show people on the screen a sort of real-time budget converted into a footprint sort of process. So the sort of outlay for the brands is sort of understanding where they come in the various parts of the process and how to use that data, rather than the actual sort of, oh god, we have to start gathering everything and putting it all in. That's kind of not the role of the brand. So hopefully that sort of dispels some myths as well. So talking about the sort of data, David, obviously we know you've been doing it a little while. It's still relatively early days in the grand scheme of the grain to glass plan. But what are you sort of finding so far? How are you sort of planning to use the data from the projects that you have got to sort of inform how you go about production? Stuart sort of mentioned, looking at flights and things like that. Is that something you're sort of factoring in? What's your sort of plan to sort of bring that into the process?
Yeah, so sort of as I said early on, use of the carbon calculator is very much embedded within our broader creative production sustainability pillar of our strategy. So obviously we use the tool, and what's brilliant about it is it helps us to identify commonalities in terms of carbon hotspots, right? So where we may be over-indexing in terms of emissions, where we under-indexing, and then it is about pulling that insight and feeding that into our charter. So our charter sort of becomes longer term, like a living, breathing document that really helps us on an ongoing basis to make more sustainable decisions in partnership with our agencies. So yeah, the data is really critical for us to make that step change, to be able to understand more about what today looks like, because ultimately that will feed into the changes that we want to drive, tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's really nice to have that sort of like, we've got this thing, it's not set in stone from day one and we'll never change it. It's like we can actually evolve this based on what we're learning as we go along. I think that's really, really lovely. And
it's going back to that point also about using the data in a meaningful way, because in some ways as an industry we're drowning in data, right? There's data collection everywhere, but it's about really trying to ensure you're using it in a meaningful way that, as I said earlier, creates action, and you drive that behavior change by using that data, by looking at how you act now and how you want to act in the future, and creating that roadmap in between. And I think that's the sweet spot really for using the calculator in conjunction with an entire sustainability program.
Yeah, that's such a nice point. And I think as well, I mean, we found that just anecdotally with our annual review, we had so much data in terms of data points. We had over 500 projects to sort of analyze and look at. And I think for us, there was a big learning in sort of, what is interesting? What do we want to tell people from this data set? And also, what can people kind of take away from it that they can then reference with their own? So, we want to sort of start showing, anyone who has a sort of big enough set of data, and we sort of say 30 as a sort of, recommended amount of projects to sort of make an analysis from. But, how to sort of look at that in relation to our annual review, is your average higher than the overall average? Is your travel and transport much lower, much higher than what we saw across the whole board? So I think, now that we have in effect the baseline, we can start to have conversations based off of that, and that's now available to anyone who has a number of projects in the tool. Everyone can download them in the same way, just as we did, analyze them in the same way. So yeah, you're right. It's about kind of taking that and sort of picking out what is the thing that we need to kind of look at here in terms of an interesting data point.
And the important thing is completing those projects.
Exactly.
He says, finger waving.
Get them completed, people. Yes, exactly. And that kind of leads me very neatly on again to Tracy. So APR have obviously been an amazing supporter for AdGreen from the start, and continually to this very moment, as one of our kind of founding advisory board members. As a company who's really driving this with your clients, do you think it's important to implement sort of operational change where suitable to sort of keep in step with your clients? Has any of your work with your brand sort of really led you guys to think about, actually we could change this within the way that we actually work as a consultancy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fundamental to that kind of consultancy role, actually. I mean, as another plug here, as sort of Ad Net Zero supporters also, action point number one is getting your own house in order. And for us, it was it was very important to ensure that we were looking at, held that mirror up to ourselves before we kind of brought to market any kind of, sustainability offering or service. And so therefore, the idea is, I think, in this space to make sure that you are walking the walk yourself, that what you're advocating, the behaviors you're advocating are something you're doing also. And so a couple of examples of things that we, made sure that we had started was, global carbon audit. So we started working with Planet Mark in 2021. We also feed into the Ad Net Zero pool of industry data, which has prompted us actually to now start tracking our home working commuter data in the UK. So we're looking at measuring how people are travelling to where they're going, what mode of transport, how far, etc. So we can start to put a number against that. And we also, I mean, we have our own set of commitments and a mission statement that we use as our North Star. But, you know, as an organisation, we're actually fairly lean from a carbon emissions perspective, because we are already almost entirely virtual, and we no longer have a corporate fleet. And as of April 24, we're going to be entirely virtual. So that's like helping us to turn our attention to what else we can be doing. So we're going to be starting to look at what those home working activities are looking like, and how we can advise our global consultants to start having a look at how they operate at home, and can we put a measurement around that. And so, you know, for us, yes, absolutely, walking the walk. You know, when working with clients, it is very important to make sure that you're learning as you go. We're all on this journey together. You know, we all kind of are way too late, however, waking up to the fact that this is a climate emergency, and we all have a part to play. So absolutely, as we go through this with our clients, it's, you know, it's something that we can all learn from each other, and start to realize what's possible within our, you know, our pocket of activity, you know, across the, which is one small part of the entire, you know, creative supply chain, but still a crucial part.
And it's the part that, you know, we can have some influence on. You know, I think it sometimes there's a sort of a tendency to think, oh, you know, this is small. You know, there's kind of a lot of other larger things that brands might have to focus on, you know, in terms of manufacturing and transportation, all those sorts of elements that are, you know, likely much bigger parts of their scope 3. But as you say, it is still a part, and there's something we can do about it. So why not engage? Well, and also there's a legal sort of element to engaging in the next, you know, it's going to come up in the next few months as well. So yeah, it's interesting how sort of things do filter through. I mean, certainly we felt the same sort of way when, you know, traveling to Cannes last year, for example. We were like, okay, how do we get there? Let's go on the train. Sophie went to an event in Berlin on the train. So, you know, it does start to make you think about the other things. We're just doing a bit of a website review at the moment and looking at how to keep that as low carbon as possible. And Lauren's been investigating all kinds of hosting for the different videos we want to have to keep it as low as possible. So it filters into everything. You know, we try not to respond to emails unnecessarily. Although I'm terrible at that. I always just want to be like, thanks.
That's a
but
great
you know, it's a little thing. Yeah, exactly. I don't have to do that anymore. What
great tool. We can all use that one, right? Yeah.
You can all borrow from my email signature where it says I'm not going to reply to you. Yeah, so it does just sort of start to filter through.
No, I have to say, actually, though, we have this kind of, one of our, you know, commitments on our mission statement is a client education program. So, you know, I'm constantly on this kind of road show, going off with my deck, and, you know, doing this kind of journey through, you know, why sustainability is important at the outset, and then how that filters through to marketing and production. And you know, I still do find myself fairly surprised to see that epiphany moment when I start to actually communicate the impacts, that production end of the supply chain, the impacts that's having on the entire footprint. And you really do see the penny drop, and people kind of go, oh God, really? Wow, I hadn't even thought about that, you know, and that kind of penny drop moment. Well, we're going to have to do something about it. And I know now, you know, I know this, I have this knowledge now, so we're going to have to take action. And so it's, you know, there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, and I think even in, like, I remember chatting to one of our trainers actually a while back now, but we were talking about sort of how to apply things to sort of, you know, your personal life. And I was like, well, I guess in theory you could, you know, you can look at any calculator to look at, you know, there's several out there on the internet to sort of look at your yearly footprint and, you know, try and get that down to zero. Like, what's your biggest part? You know, a lot of people, I think, just that carbon literacy piece is missing for so many. And that's not to say it's their fault. It's just something that we've never really thought about in that sort of a way. It's not been taught, you know, certainly wasn't taught when I was at school. You know, it's such a kind of new concept for so many that there is a big sort of knowledge gap. And obviously, you know, all of us on this call are sort of doing what we can to sort of try and close that gap. Again, great segueing, thank you. Stuart, over to you now. So obviously, as I mentioned, we're going to sort of use the data we've collected to track sort of, you know, change across the industry, and we're hoping next year we'll have more productions. We're assuming we might get a bit of a slightly higher sort of skew because we're looking to get more larger projects into the tool. Everyone, as I said, has got the opportunity to download their own data and compare it to that sort of industry published data set. how do you see the industry-wide data sort of informing production decisions going forward? And you mentioned a couple of things earlier, sort of in terms of that, sort of easy wins like catering and things, but what do you sort of see as a sort of bigger picture perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some of those easy wins for an individual brand or production, but I guess in terms of the slightly bigger picture, in terms of the industry as a whole, bringing all that data together in one place does produce a really good opportunity just for understanding, firstly, where the industry is currently and where there's some of the opportunities for easy wins, but also a great opportunity for individual brands and advertisers to be able to benchmark and understand where they are within that broader picture. Because I think there's a real need for people to kind of, again, as we talked about earlier, firstly collect the data to understand what the current situation is, so they can work out where to go, and how to make improvements and how to drive down eventually to reaching net zero, which is what we're all aiming for here. And again, just as part of that, has already been said, but on the carbon calculator, completing those productions so that people can get their own data set and make some informed decisions about their own productions is really, really important. So we'll just put out another call out for people to do that if they haven't already. But I think what one, just coming off of the back of some conversations that we've been having with members, I think one thing I would say to people is start these conversations early, in terms of with partners, with people in your supply chain. Start those conversations early about tracking, budgeting, monitoring, using the carbon calculator. One part of that as a practical example is that we've had questions from some of our members on, is in terms of, well, who's responsible for inputting data into the calculator. If there's depending on the relationship maybe that an advertiser might have with their agency partner, how is that paid for? Is it done by billable hours, or is it just a kind of a flat fee as part of the overall kind of contract and relationship that there is there? So those are all kind of good questions to ask early, so you can kind of agree it and understand how it's going to go, how it's going to work going forward. And also, I think if from previous productions there is a carbon budget that you've had and you want to drive that down, make that clear from the outset in terms of where you're heading. Maybe even think about making it part of, if you're going out for pitching, make it part of the pitching process in terms of making clear what you want and what your expectations are, or what would be a positive for someone to pitch to you in terms of what you're asking for and what you're wanting. I mean, it was really, really good, interesting to hear David talking earlier about Diageo's broader kind of net zero strategy that his team are then kind of fitting into and understanding what it means for their part of the business. I really like the phrase, from grain to glass. That's a really, really nice kind of through the whole kind of supply chain and all the way through the business. I think that's really important for the advertising element of a brand advertiser, to understand where they fit in within that broader strategy. So I think it's also important to have those internal conversations as well. But I don't know if that reflects any of the experiences that you've had, David. It'd be interesting to understand.
Yeah, no, I think for us, totally agree with everything that you said, Stuart, in regards to understanding how we can optimize the role of the carbon calculator in doing so, and the hotspots and so forth, but also the importance of the broader purpose behind what you're doing, right? So with us within creative production, it is very much laddering up to that global ambition that I sort of spoke about at the offset of the Grain to Glass Society 2030 and our brand activism programs. It's about connecting all of the pieces of the jigsaw together to create, obviously, that that masterpiece that we're all sort of working collectively together towards achieving.
Yeah, I think it's really nice. And I think the other thing is, you're sort of talking about having those conversations earlier about the sort of, setting expectations. We would like you to do this. What does that mean for you? How does that look for you guys? Sort of having that conversation in an open and sort of collaborative, reasonable sort of way as to, we want to kind of come out of this with some, some positive action. How do we share that around between us, between that sort of relationship and the suppliers? So I think that's really nice. And the other thing is that you know, obviously to sort of be able to make decisions, you need an amount of quality in that data. So it's kind of, there is an engagement needed from the brand to sort of, you know if not necessarily something's missing, but to sort of kind of get a sense of like, yeah, this feels like we've covered everything within this footprint that we think is sort of a key piece of the process in terms of the production. And we can use this in future, as you said, sort of like, this was our kind of hero, if you like, maybe our hero TVC even. And that's kind of our, you know, piece that we'll kind of bounce off of. So we're kind of expecting this as a smaller piece of content to be lower than this. So if it's higher, you start to get that sort of carbon literacy piece of like, this should be higher than this because we're doing this and we don't have this element. You know, you start to sort of, in the same way you would a budget, you start to sort of get that, you know, that internal sort of sense when you're looking at a footprint and you're looking at a new piece of work. So I think that's, you know, that's sort of where we sort of want to encourage people to get to when it comes to sort of engaging with this sort of thing.
Definitely.
So
can I just jump in, Joe, with just another thought off the back of that? I totally agree with everything you're saying there, but I think it's also, and again, this is coming from an ISBA point of view, as the you know, the trade association for the brand within the industry and within the supply chain, but ultimately within, I guess, the production supply chain for advertising. The brand, the advertiser, is the customer there, so the advertiser has a real position to be able to drive this change, and obviously there's really keen partners and great opportunities for collaboration. There's people throughout that whole supply chain who want to be part of that change, who want to work collaboratively on this, and there's some really great work that's going on. But ultimately, within that supply chain, the brand, the advertiser, is the customer. So that there's a really good opportunity. There's a great chance here for the advertiser to drive that change when they're having those conversations with their partners, with their people supplying the services within that supply chain.
Yeah, and I think kind of on the flip side of that, there's an amazing opportunity for the production suppliers to kind of offer these sorts of services to upskill the teams to know that they can provide what the brands are going to be looking for, whether they're looking for it yesterday or in, you know, a year's time when they sort of get on the train, as it were. So I think that also works both ways. David, coming to you before I kind of have a final wrap-up question for everyone. There are many brands who have not yet claimed their carbon calculator accounts. So I'll just let you kind of give some context to that. So when a product is created and it's sent off to us before completion, if the brand doesn't exist in the tool, the people who have created that product have the opportunity to create it so they can kind of assign it to a particular brand or brand parent. So what we have now is a number of accounts where essentially there's a number of footprints attributed to them, but no one is looking at that data yet because they haven't got engaged for whatever reason. What would you say as a kind of call to action, a rallying cry to these brands that have, you know, they have potential data sat behind that login screen, but they aren't looking at it yet? What would you say to them?
Yeah, so sort of stemming on a lot of what Stuart's actually said, it's really important to sort of understand the data and the impacts that we're all making, and at an industry level, you know, we all have a responsibility and we all can make a change, sort of regardless of size of brand, level of creative production activity. So any shift is a positive shift, you know, large or small. So I'd sort of just say to everybody, we can all do something, but ultimately nothing will change at scale unless we all sort of come to arms in unison to drive that change within our industry. So I'm hoping that's ignited sort of everybody on the call. Honestly, it's also, I would sort of want to say it is a journey. So it is not a light switch moment where, you know, one day, great, you're like net carbon. Like the reality is that isn't going to happen. It is a journey. So there are going to be bumps sort of along the way, which is absolutely fine. It's just a learning opportunity. So it's about, again, taking those failures, understanding maybe what's not worked as planned, and then obviously optimizing, sort of moving forward. But everything ultimately happens for a reason.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think it's fair to say as well that the team, sort of the AdGreen team, are also looking at, you know, which of those brands have the most. I think one of them has around 50 projects that are completed, essentially assigned to their brand. So there are some really big accounts to sort of claim. They're like unclaimed lottery prizes. So we are sort of trying to help those brands sort of get on board and sort of understand what treasure trove they have as well. So so yeah, we may well be in touch with you if we can find out someone to get in touch with. That's the challenge. That's where Stuart comes in, so that's fine. So, and I've noticed there's a question in the chat as well, which is a really good question, and something that is, I won't lie, is a challenge. So there's a question in the chat: how are brands ensuring data quality / consistency and avoiding human error that invariably or inevitably results from manual data entry? I think this is a really good question. It's a question that we kind of get asked as well, sort of how can we as AdGreen help with that? So I guess that's the position I can answer this question from, which is the tool at the moment as it stands has a number of obviously a number of inputs around a number of activity types, and we are actually just building in some additional prompts to help people input data in a more accurate way. So sort of common mistakes we've seen over the past year, and sort of seeing whether we can help reduce those by sort of adding in some prompts. We also do a check on at the moment all projects that we're reviewing, whether that's necessary for the smaller ones that only have a minimal amount of activities, for example, or a very low budget, where we look at the project as a whole, as a sort of holistic view. It's this budget, we know it's on location, we'd expect to see sort of these common activities from that sort of production, and again training people. So the module I mentioned earlier about sort of using your budget to create a footprint. So it isn't an exact science. I won't lie to you. It is a learning for everyone, and there are things that we'd like to do with the tool in the future to help the productions be more consistent across the board, but B, to also help brands to sort of look at what the scope of their scope 3 is. So helping them to kind of set out what they want from their suppliers for their productions versus perhaps what another brand who has a slightly different scope of their scope 3 might look like. So it's a constant ongoing conversation, but it's a great question. So thanks for asking it, Jennifer. And that leaves me with just, go for it, Tracy.
Can I just chip in there very, very quickly?
Yeah.
I think just touching that in answer to that question, touching on two of the things that we've discussed here, the necessity for this to be client-led in many cases, and also, the kind of role of an external partner of some kind, because the reality is there is an element of implementation that needs to take place. Everybody needs to understand exactly what they need to do now that's different to what they were doing before, and at what point in the process they need to kick in and do those new things. And just expecting people to know that is not going to set you up for success. There needs to be a workflow, there needs to be template, there needs to be all of that stuff in place, because we have to recognize that we've got agencies with multiple clients, multiple drivers, multiple commitments, multiple new models that they need to fit into. And so being very clear as a client about your expectations for your agency partners is absolutely essential. And part of that is about exactly what data needs to be put into that calculator and when. So being very clear about that will mitigate some of that human error.
Absolutely. I think the sort of earlier progress is better than perfection also kind of comes into play when you're talking about people just getting started, and not being put off by the fact that every footprint has to be perfect. I mean, we've had people sort of say, I couldn't get the third Sparks mileage details. It's like, well, there's an element of, we expect you to sort of be able to kind of, sort of condense or collate entries and sort of have a general mileage pot until you know more. It might be that you can't get some of the information, and that's just the way that is right now. And it might be sort of market variables as well in terms of what you can get from your suppliers. So it's really about us sort of understanding the landscapes, knowing how we can support different users in different places, with different sort of limitations and challenges. So there's lots of sort of elements of that sort of come into play at different parts of the process, and with different the different organizations that are engaged in the sort of the journey as well. So yeah, great question. Thanks. We should have added that in ourselves. Great. So I'm just going to wrap that up. I'll be in touch, Jennifer, about our next event and the questions we're going to have. We'll get your feedback for a few more. So final question, again, another sort of request for a rallying cry. If you all had one tip for somebody perhaps listening on this call or checking out the video afterwards when it's online, at a brand who's beginning to engage with sustainable production methods, what would your one tip be? I'm going to come to Stuart first.
Straight to it. I think I may have more than one, but obviously I think the obvious one that
I'll
hopefully
ease
everyone has taken away from this call is if you're not already use a carbon calculator for your advertising production. If not, that mean that if you're at the very beginning of that journey, do that. That's the best one single hot tip that we could recommend from this. If you take away, please do that, because then as we talked about, once you've got that data, you're building that picture, you can understand the things that you can then do. The other thing I would say though is if you're maybe slightly further along that journey and you've got organizational buy-in in terms of AdGreen and supporting the work that it does, is look at the AdGreen levy, because the team obviously provide the calculator, but also training, resources. But part of the support for the team is through the levy, which is a voluntary levy, but needs to be worked out with your agency partners. So I would encourage you to look at that as well to support the team and the good work that they're doing, but also so they can do more in the future. And then thirdly, just a little shout out for us, but I would say that if you are a brand advertiser who is wanting to understand more, learn more in this space, and you're at the start of that journey, then either please, if you're already a member, please get involved in our sustainability forum. If not, please drop me an email and it'd be great to talk to you about how we can hopefully help or work with you.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Love that second tip as well. Great shout out for the levy. I'm here for levy questions post-event as needed. Next up, Tracy, what's your top tip?
Okay, Echo, obviously, if you're not using it yet, use the calculator. I think we all have to say that. But I would say don't get overwhelmed. It's really easy to try and tackle this area and just have it feel like a immovable mountain. So, get the expertise you need if you don't have it in-house. Ask the questions, find some champions and get started somewhere. Even if you're starting very small and just setting really, really small, what might feel like small milestones at the outset, you've started your journey, and it will be remarkable to you how much it snowballs, because your agency and your creative partners are an essential part of this journey. And so, and you will find once you start engaging with them that they have their own targets and commitments that they need to be meeting, and working with their clients on this is actually doing them a huge amount of favors internally to help them meet their own corporate commitments, and everybody kind of gets it behind it together. So yeah, don't get overwhelmed, start somewhere, even if it's small steps at the outset, and don't be afraid to ask questions.
I think for my tip, totally agree with both of Stuart and Tracy. So mine would be, have purpose, right? And within that, and I know that can be quite ambiguous. What I mean is, do this because you believe truly at a brand level that this is the right thing to do, right? So it's not about a box ticking exercise, right? So be authentic in why you're doing this. I think it's also really important to have clear goals and outcomes, like what does success look like, and that helps to guide decisions that you make and the plans that you create. And then to Tracy's point around creative agency partners and your agency ecosystem partners, they are massively important, in the journey that you're going to go on, as well as, industry forums such as this is massively insightful, ISBA as well. So it's about creating the relationships across the industry to support the journey that you're on. And then the last point that, again, I think, Tracy, you made is around this is a journey, right? So everything is not going to go to a plan immediately, and that's absolutely okay. It's about being on the journey, and then taking those learnings when things don't go to plan, and optimizing your plans ultimately to drive you towards those outcomes that are hopefully very clear.
We've certainly been on journey for the last
to
get here. That's all.
Okay, you guys nailed it. Nailed it with those tips. And you're sat in the same room, so it must be going fast.
Sat in the same room, still talking and everything.
Okay, well, thank you so much to all three of you, Stuart, David and Tracy. It's been brilliant to hear your experiences so far, what you're planning for the future, how you're sort of supporting, you know, your members, Stuart, your clients, Tracy, your production suppliers, David. It's been really lovely, really nice sort of different perspectives as well. I'm kind of excited to see what we get in our next annual review. I'm sure Lauren's less excited because it was quite arduous to put it together. But yeah, we're excited to see what kind of comes next with our kind of data as well. We also wanted to remind people on the call that you can do your own data analysis by downloading your CSV file. There's a 1-minute video on how to do this. It's going to hopefully come up in the chat in a moment. And our previous events for agencies and production companies are also available on our website. So do have a look at those. They've got some really interesting discussions with the panel guests from those areas about the specific challenges and sort of wins by those company types as well. So I'd highly recommend them for brands too, because it's really nice to kind of collaborate and learn from each other. And the last thing to say is thank you so much to Lauren for putting this together, and for you guys for joining us, and everyone who's been listening on the call as well. It's been a really lovely event, and this wraps up our annual review nicely. So thank you to everyone, and we'll see you soon.
See you later. Bye.
Thanks.